Hello, and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. I'm Stefan, more known on the subreddit as Bernardito, and I will be the guest host for this episode. Have you ever heard of the Taiping Rebellion? Apparently, it was a conflict that killed over 20 million people. Or did it? In this episode, we're going to explore the myths, the realities, and the fascinating history of the Taiping Rebellion.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. I'm Stefan Quiroga. I will be the guest host for this episode, and I have the distinct pleasure to be joined by EnclavedMicrostate, who is flaired in the Taiping Rebellion and the Opium Wars. Now, we are here today to talk about the Taiping Rebellion. But before we do that, I'm curious to know about your background. What made you so interested in the Taiping Rebellion?
To some extent, it was just a complete accident. It was a couple of years back. I sort of picked up a couple of books that I'd been got for my birthday and hadn't got around to reading yet. And both of them were on Chinese history topics, and one in particular talked about the significance of rivers in sort of across the broad sweep of Chinese history, across a series of little thematic essays. And one of them talked about the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, which was the state that the Taiping Rebellion tried to create, and the way in which it used sort of classical motifs that had been derived from sort of the importance of river systems in the way that it had chosen to challenge the Qing dynasty that was then ruling China. So, I mean, that set me off. I thought, what an interesting angle on an event that you tend to hear from listicles quite a lot about, deadly revolt led by pseudo-Christians and so on. And so that got me into reading into it a lot more seriously. And I discovered that there's actually a really substantial corpus of secondary sources in the English language, actually, on the event, more than you'd expect for what seems like such an obscure event to most people. Yeah, and that's got me to where I am now for the most part.
Mid to late 19th century conflicts not involving European powers or the United States are usually seen in a very trivia-based context. Something that you'd bring up in a quiz or in sort of a, today I learned kind of context. And the Taiping Rebellion is definitely one of those. What is the popular view of the Taiping Rebellion?
What's quite interesting is sort of two little things, because the first thing is the Taiping Rebellion does actually involve a little bit of European action, especially in its later stages, but I suppose that's a bit beside the point now. When we look really at kind of what most people will be able to say about the Taiping Rebellion, I think thanks to the invention of the listicle, the fact that the Taiping Rebellion is often said to have been the cause of anywhere from 20 to 100 million deaths, depending on basically what kind of metrics you're using, means that it appears on a lot of listicles. And then kind of you trace back from that, what caused it? This guy is, the Chinese brother of Jesus, how weird. And recent books on the topic have actually pointed out that kind of weird paradoxical duality that you have on the one hand, a kind of appreciation, albeit in a very superficial sense, of this event's extremely vast human cost, and yet at the same time an extremely superficial view of its causes as well, that kind of looks at it as extremely weird and kooky.
With that said, what is the scholarly view of this conflict?
It really depends on what angle you want to take with it, which is really interesting because there are a lot of possible angles. From a political angle, it's usually seen as a key event in what ultimately causes the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911. From a religious angle, although it used to be kind of dismissed as, a load of people who don't understand Christianity, in more recent years there has been kind of a more concerted attempt to rehabilitate it as kind of an actual localized form of Christianity. Whether, you can really call it that necessarily is also to an extent up for debate. But certainly the view of the way in which the Taiping religion existed, for example, has become a lot more nuanced in recent years as we kind of eschewed a more Eurocentric view of Chinese history in general towards a more kind of endogenous China-centered model.
The local perspective, I think, is one of the most interesting developments in history. I mean, that's sort of what always fascinates me whenever I do my research. So let's start there. Let's start at the beginning. Where does the religion come from? Because we're talking about Christianity, right?
It's a complicated question because whether or not you want to call it Christianity depends so heavily on what you think, to an extent, Christianity means. And it's important to note that it's really not just Christianity alone that is an influence on Taiping religion. In fact, to be brutally honest, the best way to describe Taiping religion might be as kind of a mixture of the Bible and classical pre-Confucian texts for the most part, and in general framed by a very Chinese context. And this is a context in which you have numerous religious traditions already established. You have Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism being the three big ones, and into which you suddenly have missionaries trying to spread Christianity remotely without actually being able to physically place themselves where they're trying to proselytize. And essentially locals coming across text, and in the particular case of the Taiping, actually reading them for once instead of using them for God knows what. I mean, thousands get distributed and no one knows where they end up. And actually reading them and applying a particularly unique view of these texts to produce a new kind of theology and framework of social ideas.
As you mentioned, it's a very complex question, but I think you've established the theology here. So who believed in this?
It's, again, one of those things that no one can really be sure. Can kind of infer from the fact that they still keep having proper religious services, even as the war starts to drag on and make them less frequent, as evidence for perhaps continued attachment to the religion. But it's a question that's made very complicated by the fact that we don't really have any sources from the personal perspective of people, of Chinese individuals within the Taiping movement, beyond its leaders, who are, to a great extent, the people responsible for kind of running the religion, if you will.
And that is, of course, a classical obstacle that we historians face in our research, finding sources from the everyday man, the subaltern. If we look at this a little bit broader, in terms of geography, what are we looking at? Where are we located?
One of the most important things to think about with regards to China, particularly late imperial, republican, and modern China, is that you can't think of it as purely a monolith. There are huge geographical divides. I mean, you can divide it into, I forget who it was, who divided China proper into, say, 7 major economic zones. And on top of that, you have imperial possessions, particularly in Muslim Xinjiang and Tibet. And then the Qing dynasty's founders, the Manchus, have their own region of Manchuria. When we talk about Taiping Rebellion, we're mostly talking about kind of South China, which is in itself quite a vague concept. There's really 2 major sub-regions of South China that we need to be considering. The first is what, kind of in the more abstract sense, is called the Lingnan region, which roughly corresponds to what was then called the Viceroyalty of Liangguang. So that's the provinces of Guangdong and Guangxi. So this is roughly in the area of modern-day Hong Kong. The other area we need to consider is really the lower Yangtze Valley. The Taiping migrated out of the Liangguang region into the lower Yangtze, and their main center of power was at Nanjing, although they ultimately ended up controlling an axis that stretched almost up to the major city of Wuhan, and also almost down to the coast at Shanghai. So the important things to remember about South China is that, firstly, it was, and to an extent still is, quite distinct from North China, both culturally and to an extent economically. Southern China in particular was relatively well integrated into global trade. Obviously, it became significantly more so in 1842 after the end of the Opium War. But in terms of cuisine, there were really perceptible differences, even within the northern part of South China and the southern part of South China. Along the coast, there was much more linguistic diversity compared to the interior. The interior was mostly Mandarin speaking. The exterior, or the coast rather, you had Cantonese and Min and Hakka, etc. And on top of that, there's a degree of kind of geographical isolation between the coastal and the inland regions. Major mountain ranges help to create natural barriers between the south coast provinces, particularly Guangdong and Guangxi, and kind of the inland core along the Yangtze.
With that said, now we know a little bit more about the theology, we know about the geography, but let's go back to the leader. Did the Taiping have a leader, or did it have leaders?
The Taiping can most accurately be said to have had leaders, but these leaders changed quite often. The person that everyone remembers is a guy known as Hung Xiuquan. He wouldn't have been brought up by that name. In fact, we know that he wasn't. He was actually born Hung Huoxiu. What's significant about Hung Xiuquan is that he was not part of the majority ethnic subgroup of Guangdong province where he was born. He was not what's a so-called punti, that is a local. He didn't speak the local language of Cantonese, he spoke Hakka. I've slightly misrepresented that. In reality, the Hakka, which literally translates to guest people, had lived there for centuries, but there was still kind of a significant tension between the Hakka, who were less of a presence and particularly concentrated in rural areas, with the Punti, who were the majority in the province. So Hung basically emerges facing quite a lot of, kind of at the broader level, of sort of social disadvantages compared to his fellow Punti provincials. What we know about Hung's early background is that his parents were sort of moderately well off, and he was notably the third son of the family. What's significant about this is that usually the first few sons of the family would be required basically to go into agricultural labour as quickly as possible. But that meant that your younger sons could usually receive an education if you were sort of a rural, non-tenant farmer. So as in you owned your own land but might not be earning that much more than subsistence. And that means that Hung receives potentially a pretty comprehensive Confucian education. And the reason I say potentially comprehensive is that clearly he is aware of texts beyond the sort of core 4 books and 5 classics that were required for the exams. He shows a familiarity with earlier classical pre-Confucian texts. If you look at later Taiping propaganda and government documents, a lot of these actually appeal to texts that are not in the core canon. What Hung does with this knowledge is he does what kind of everyone to some extent aspires to, which is he tries to enter the bureaucracy. The common story is that he passed the sort of local level annual exams with flying colours when he was 16, but what we know pretty much for certain is that he consistently failed to obtain a degree at the second level of the 4 exam tiers, which was the provincial exams. This is not that hard to believe, or rather not that uncommon, because at the time, the size of the bureaucracy was actually pretty tiny. I'm hesitant to say there were more than about 10,000 bureaucrats in a country of about 450 million people. And the number of bureaucrats had not increased since the beginning of the dynasty, whereas the size of the population had tripled. And this meant that prospects for career advancement had been shrinking pretty rapidly since the 1600s. And so Hung's repeated failures are very normal indeed. What Hung ends up, and when Hung does these exams, he isn't staying in his home village anymore. He's moving down to the provincial capital at Canton or Guangzhou in Mandarin. And at Canton in 1836, he happens to come across an American missionary. The exact missionary we're not certain of. It's usually alleged to be a guy called Edwin Stevens. The exact person doesn't matter. What's significant is this missionary gives him a pamphlet called Good Words for Admonishing the Age. It's written in Chinese by a Chinese Protestant convert who is, at this stage, an exile in Malacca, because at the time, Qing regulations prevented proselytization on a large scale by missionaries. And what's significant about the Good Words is that takes a large number of little excerpts of various biblical passages like Noah's flood or bits of the Gospels and arranges them next to sections of commentary. We don't know for sure if Hung reads this straight away, but he certainly takes it with him. When he next attempts the exams, he does so and fails again, but when he goes home, he starts to suffer from severe fever dreams. Clearly, the stress got to him and he became violently physically ill. And the way it's told changed actually the more times the Taiping retold it to add more and more details. But in terms of the basic idea of what happened, he is said to have been taken up to heaven before this figure who calls himself the Heavenly Father. The Heavenly Father claims that he created all mankind and all the earth and was displeased that it seemed that mankind was now worshipping demons instead of him. So he exhorts Hung to go forth with a demon-slaying sword to expel the demons from heaven and then to expel the demons from earth. And he is guided in this by a so-called heavenly elder brother. The thing is, at the first it just seems like a completely out-of-nowhere hallucination, and so, as far as we can tell, he spends the next 6 years just going on with his life. It's when in 1843, after another exam failure, that he decides to actually read this pamphlet that he has at the prodding of a cousin who comes across them, that he basically puts two and two together. He associates himself with this kind of not explicitly mentioned second son of God in the Bible by associating this heavenly father and his visions with God, this heavenly elder brother with Jesus, and crucially, and this is where it gets really, really interesting, with a couple of little linguistic coincidences between the pamphlet and events that he himself has experienced, or more specifically, his own name. Because the character Hung in Hung Huo Xiu's name means flood, and this is the particular character that was used to refer to the Great Flood of Noah. And moreover, during the dream, he was actually told by this Heavenly Father figure that he could no longer use the Huo in his name, that it had become taboo in the same way that you weren't allowed to use the characters in an emperor's name. And what does he find in the pamphlets but Jehovah, transliterated as Ye Huo Hua, which confirms to him that the Heavenly Father and the God that is mentioned in this pamphlet are one and the same. This becomes, by to some extent sheer coincidence, the event that makes Hung believe that he actually has a particular spiritual journey, that he has a duty to cleanse some vague, ambiguous demons from China. And Hung decides that he actually has to spread this message and goes with a cousin of his called Feng Yunshan. This is a separate cousin from the guy who told him to read the pamphlets, to the province of Guangxi, where they set up a community called the God-Worshipping Society. And the God-Worshipping Society gradually gains followers over time by essentially acting as a mutual support organization. It offers support against sort of overextension of elite power. It acts as a militia to fight off bandits and river pirates. So they eventually grow a pretty substantial following around it. In 1846, a particularly significant event happens because Hung is approached by representatives of another American missionary called Issachar Roberts to come to Canton, where he for a while receives some slightly more orthodox Protestant instruction. He is sent away sort of somewhat ignominiously after what his cousin alleges were some intrigues with the other convert students, but he leaves significantly for the first time with a full Bible. And this Bible ends up being the basis of Taiping printings, which we can get onto later if you'd like.
So we have a leader, we have believers, we have a theology, we have a geographic region. Now we're moving towards a conflict, a war.
Yes.
When does this war take place? If we start with the simple basic facts.
The simple dates of it, the war takes place from pretty much late 1850, early 1851. The exact date you want to pick can vary, up to, in practical terms, 1864, though there are remnants who hang around till 1866.
So it's a considerably long war.
It is very substantial. Most of the American Civil War happens alongside it. The entire Second Opium War happens slap bang in the middle. And part of the reason it lasts so long is that the Taiping have several lucky breaks in their early years, and also end up with a bit of a snowballing effect as they basically grow themselves and gain more followers, and in doing so attract more followers.
That leads to the question, of course, why did it happen?
Why does it happen is the particular motivations of sort of the core god-worshipping society in Guangdong and Guangxi, and particularly Guangxi, can to some extent, but not completely, be distinguished from the people who are ultimately their most numerous followers, who are the population of Hunan, Hubei, and Jiangsu, which are kind of the interior regions that they end up moving to along the lower Yangtze. In Guangdong and Guangxi, I think it's not unreasonable to say the religion has something to do with it, that it offers a slightly more kind of optimistic millenarian view of kind of their long-term goal than other anti-Qing societies like the Triad Society or the Heaven and Earth Society, who seemed pretty much solely focused on getting rid of the Qing. But more broadly, and this is what I think was slightly more influential for people further inland, was that there was increasing dissatisfaction with the Qing government. In the years leading up to the Taiping Rebellion, the relative exchange rate of silver to copper had basically collapsed. Copper currency had undergone essentially an inflation crisis that the Qing government had seemed incapable of resolving. Local elites were becoming increasingly powerful, in part as a result of the White Lotus Revolt, which necessitated huge militia reforms that mainly focused on the elite building up their control over local communities. And on top of that, the problem of reduced career prospects due to rising population, general economic decline, was basically making the Qing dynasty seem less and less of a effective government to a lot of people. There are some assertions that the First Opium War had an effect, that people saw defeat to Britain as embarrassing in some way. This is really mostly a retroactive appellation from the 1930s. Really, there was no strong sense of kind of the humiliation of the Opium War until the Republican period.
Are we talking about two very specific sides, or are there more groups involved?
The war makes most sense if you think of a large number of groups with distinct interests, but who kind of coalesce into two sides as their interests align. The key, if you will, anti-Qing belligerents are the Taiping, but to some extent there is kind of more general peasant dissatisfaction with the Qing. And the Taiping have kind of a loose alliance with another rebel confederation called the Nian. But the Nian are much less organized, and they're significantly further north, sort of a little bit south of Beijing, mainly in the Shandong area. Whereas on the Qing side, it's a real mishmash. The Qing themselves have their own regular forces, and the Qing, of course, are kind of the Manchu dynasty made up of foreign conquerors, and their regular forces don't do particularly well. The Taiping are consistently able to break out of encirclements in their early years, and later on to get onto the lower Yangtze and overwhelm any defences there. And so they have to appeal to provincial level elites. The most significant of these was Zhang Guofan, who in 1853 was ordered in his home province of Hunan, which bureaucrats were not supposed to normally operate in their home provinces. He was ordered to create an army of militia to try and defend his home province. But over time, as the regular armies are sort of worn down and destroyed, these militia armies, especially Zhang Guofan's army in Hunan, take over most of the war effort. But the provincial armies have a significantly different agenda than the Qing. The Qing are trying to retain the integrity of the entire empire. The provincial armies, to an extent, are mostly interested in their provinces first, and then on dealing with threats outside them. So the Hunan army first focuses on reconsolidating Hunan before moving northwards to deal with the Taiping, who are far lower down the Yangtze in Nanjing. And provincial armies don't always follow imperial orders. Zhang Guofan, in particular, repeatedly defies orders to sort of attack certain targets and instead works on his own strategy of gradually working down the Taiping strongholds towards their capital rather than an excessively hasty attack without dealing with their larger economic base. You also, interestingly, have a strong European component. Again, as with a lot of things to do with the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom and the Taiping Rebellion, there is huge disagreement as to how important the fact that there was Western intervention in the war was. Simply put, there was a significant amount of Western resistance to the Taiping, especially as they moved towards Shanghai. At first, there was kind of a curiosity and a potential hope that the Taiping might displace the Qing. In 1853, there are several diplomatic missions sent, all end in pretty much disaster as neither side really understands each other's agenda that well. And when the Taiping move on Shanghai in 1860, the difference now is that the West actually have a stake in keeping the Qing in power because they now have concessions from the Qing that they aren't sure the Taiping will be willing to offer them. So Western authorities essentially assist the Qing against the Taiping. At first it's indirectly. They fund mercenaries or they refuse to send supplies to Taiping cities that are under siege on the basis that this allegedly violated neutrality, but in fact this was mostly being done by private traders. But ultimately this escalates to full-on commitment of regular army and navy forces. So in 1862, for example, British soldiers evict the Taiping from the city of Ningbo on the coast, which cuts them off from any direct access to maritime trade. From 1860 to 1863, there is a European-funded mercenary force called the Ever Victorious Army, first led by an American named Frederick Townsend Ward, and then by a British officer named Charles Gordon, which supports Qing forces operating in the Shanghai area. And in fact, after the war, there is a period of significant Western cooperation with the Qing. They help build arsenals and train troops, and in fact, a lot of Westerners help collect customs for the Qing. So there is a significant shift in this regard during the Taiping period, where the West becomes a Qing ally, which they remain for another at least 2 decades.
And that's obviously a very interesting note to make, how all these things interconnect. Of course, you mentioned Charles Gordon, who would become known as Chinese Gordon and ultimately die in Khartoum in Sudan in 1885 in a very, very dramatic Victorian way. But going back to the Taiping, how were they organized?
This is one of those things where we have how they said they were organized, but we don't know for sure how well they kept to it. The very interesting thing about the Taiping is that they were uniquely very literate for a 19th century Chinese rebellion. They left behind a vast corpus of textual sources that, I mean, compared to something like the Nian or the White Lotus, just doesn't exist. This corpus of sources includes a particularly interesting document called The Land System of the Heavenly Dynasty. The way it lays out the Taiping organization is that it theoretically eradicates any distinction between the civil and military spheres. Every family is enrolled on basically a conscription list. Every family must provide one male family member, and this male family member could be of any potential rank within the organization. So you have anything from ordinary privates up to generals being provided by individual, well, not families, but households. And military officials also had civil duties, and there was no distinction between them. So, for example, men who were in charge of 25 men were also responsible for holding church services. The men responsible for 1,250 men also had duties regarding the arbitration of legal cases or the disbursement of funds. And the way they theoretically organized was that every 13,000 odd families was organized into a so-called field army, led by a general, and that would organize around this basic unit. What's particularly interesting, but also particularly ambiguous, is where women fit into this organization. We know that women were supposedly also subject to the same system of conscription, that you did have camps of women with military ranks. What we don't know for sure is how much, and if so, how much variation there was in female involvement in the military and civil spheres. For example, we do know that someone of the rank of Chancellor, which was the highest rank below sort of full-on noble title, was a successful, a successful exam candidate who was a woman. But she appears to have been a complete exception, and in fact, we mostly know about her because she got fired. The way that titles are described, it seems that women are mostly involved in agricultural and manual labour and not in military duties. At the same time, we get occasional hints that there are full units of women. The reason I mention this is also because for a while there was a policy of strict segregation between men and women. The Taiping were, in their earlier stages, very Puritan about sexuality, and part of the reason was that in the Taiping conception of conception, everyone was the son or daughter of God. And so, technically, any kind of sexual romantic attraction could be legally considered incest. It's one of those very bewildering decisions that we're not sure why they made to begin with, nor why they reversed. But, I mean, it is significant insofar as it comes as part of a general, slightly, to us anyway, alien conception of gender in the Taiping system. But it is important to note that it seems, in theory, that along with segregation came equality, but in practice, probably less so.
That's incredibly interesting. The idea of including women in armed forces, whether they are non-state forces or even state forces, is not entirely uncommon in the late 19th century, particularly
If I may interject slightly, one particularly interesting source for us was a British mercenary who fought for the Taiping, actually. His estimate was that something like 25% of the Taiping army were women at the time he was there. I'm inclined to think this is optimistic, seeing how little anyone else remarks on it, but there you go.
It must have shocked him enough to even bring that number up, I think. But look, going back to the actual Taiping soldiers themselves, how did they fight the war? Was it more of like a guerrilla conflict, or did they fight more conventionally in set piece battles?
The way in which the Taiping War was fought could depend a bit on which theatre of the war was under discussion. So, particularly on the Yangtze, where the Taiping were fighting the provincial armies, the Taiping were known to fight very much in the form of ambushes, but it seems as though this was part of a broader system of having both field forces ready for more pitched battles and kind of ambush forces intended to harass the enemy. So it's a mixture in that regard of kind of a more sort of guerrilla-based approach and a more conventional approach. Certainly, the Taiping army appears to have been substantial enough that they could stand toe-to-toe with the Qing on many occasions. Zhang Guofan estimates that there were perhaps around 600,000 Taiping troops. That's probably a bit generous, but I don't think it's unrealistic to say that kind of at their height, there might have been around 500,000 to 400,000 Taiping soldiers under arms, and this would have been comparable to the size of the armies that the Qing could put out. One particularly significant element was sieges. Sieges could last for only a brief moment. Wuhan falls relatively quickly, despite being one of the largest cities on the Yangtze. At the time it was Wuchang, Hankou, and Hanyang, which I suppose made it slightly easier. But the sieges of Anqing and Nanjing in 1860 to 61 and 63 to 64, respectively, took upwards of 12 months each. In the Eastern Theatre, around Shanghai, however, sieges tended to be much shorter, because there you have European artillery involved, and that pretty much deals with the issue of getting through the walls without too much difficulty, and thus you had relatively rapid progress when the war starts getting underway in the Shanghai-Nanjing axis, compared to relatively slow and drawn-out sieges along the Wuhan-Nanjing axis.
Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, which is of course the 20 million estimated having died in the war.
This is a number that has an origin that, is, as far as I'm aware, can only be traced to an American commenter in Beijing saying that that's what the alleged death toll is. We have virtually no good figures on the number of casualties caused by the Taiping War at all. 20 million is not an unrealistic estimate, but the trouble is we have to also account for the fact that it's not the only rebellion happening in China. There are revolts of Muslims in Western China and Xinjiang during the 1860s that also happen. The Nian, as I've mentioned further north, Muslims in the southwestern province of Yunnan set up kind of a little independent polity for a few years, and that was quite destructive. There's also significant damage as a result of flooding in the late 19th century, and the reason I bring all these up is because our only two major census figures are for 1851 and for 1911. They show that the population was about the same between the two, which, when you consider that the population tripled between 1644 and 1851, shows pretty soberingly how much the population might have been set back by. But who knows how much it actually was set back by, especially when you consider how many possible things were going on at once that could have caused it.
With that said, how did the war actually end?
The war ends essentially by the Taiping getting slowly worn down. The million-dollar question is, were the Taiping doomed to fail simply because the provincial armies were so tough? Were they doomed to fail because they had no good leadership? Or was a European intervention the key thing? So we can address these one by one. The provincial armies ultimately proved utterly tenacious. The Hunan army was pretty badly destroyed again and again, but kept coming back in a way that the Taiping really couldn't deal with. Neither side was ever critically short of manpower, mind you, but the Hunan army sort of builds a lot of experience, and its general in particular, Zhang Guofan, becomes an incredibly capable operational commander. And the Hunan army, despite taking horrendous casualties in several engagements, are able to maintain, in the long run, a campaign against the Taiping, and their masterstroke is actually attacking Anqing and cutting off a lot of Taiping supplies further south, which allows them to roll that up. Were the provincial army simply too strong? That's a possibility. My inclination, however, is that actually the Taiping never really had a good leadership, and I suppose this fills in what I mentioned when I said the Taiping sort of had leaders, but one in particular stands out. During their early years, the Taiping had a little sort of cabal of leaders, 6 men, all titled something king. So you had the Heavenly King, Hong Xiuquan, the North, East, South, and West kings, and the Wing or Assistant King, Wing being sort of the things that birds have and not a Chinese term. But over time, some of them die, and one in particular, a guy called Yang Xiuqing, accumulates slightly more power than anyone, I think, had hoped. Because during those early days in Guangxi, the Taiping had been quite willing to adopt a lot of local traditions, and one of these was spirit channeling. Yang Xiuqing, the East King, and Xiao Chaogui, the West King, had basically taken over the movement briefly while Hung and Feng were dealing with legal issues, and they were able to do so because Yang claimed to be able to channel the voice of God, and Xiao the voice of Jesus. While we're not exactly sure what their relationship to each other was, it seems to be the case that when Xiao, the voice of Jesus, was killed, and Feng Yunshan, Hung's cousin, were killed in battle on the way to Nanjing, this kind of disrupted a kind of power balance between Hung, kind of the erstwhile leader of the movement, and Yang, who could theoretically outrank him at any point he wanted. And although Yang was a very brilliant strategist in many ways, he also appears to have had much wider ambitions, and Hung, who decided that his position was incredibly insecure because of Yang's ambition, decided that he had to get rid of Yang, and in 1856 he ordered Yang assassinated. And this basically got out of hand very, very quickly. He brings the North King, Wei Changhui, in to do it, but the North King, we don't know really why, seems to have gone on a complete rampage and killed several other people, including the family of the Wing King, Shi Dakai. Shi is unsurprisingly not too pleased with this, and has Wei killed, and then deciding that he wasn't going to be that safe if he stayed at the capital, left Nanjing entirely with a sizable army, try and set up kind of a Taiping sympathetic state in Sichuan, where at least he could continue to fight the good fight without the risk of being killed through political intrigue. After that, it seems to have been relative anarchy in the Taiping camp until about 1859. You can't really say that there's any particular leader. The Taiping civil leaders are Hung's brothers, and they prove pretty inept. Their function appears to have been pretty much just handing out titles, mostly to themselves. You have a new chief of staff called Meng De-un, who appears to have been accomplished in the civil sphere, but who simply had no military experience, and so none of the generals actually bother listening to his orders. All of the campaigns are being conducted very much on individual initiative. And even afterwards, when you have a new crop of leaders, the most significant one being Hung Rengan, who is Hung's younger cousin, who is especially interesting because he had a European education in Hong Kong. Hung Rengan loses control over the generals quite quickly, and they prove not very good at cooperating with each other either. And in fact, Zheng Guofan's Hunan army is saved from utter annihilation at one stage because the two Taiping generals, Li Xiucheng and Cheng Yucheng, prove unable to cooperate with each other and actually perform the pincer maneuver they were supposed to. One attacked about a month before the other, and so were defeated separately. So I think leadership failure is one particularly important point here. The Taiping central leadership just wasn't united at all, apart from a couple of brief windows. But I think it isn't invalid to point out a significant European interference in it. The siege of Anting was undoubtedly accelerated by the fact that the Qing government convinced the Europeans to blockade the city to European traders and thereby prevent the Taiping from getting supplies through it. Moreover, by preventing the Taiping taking Shanghai, they no longer had an alternative economic base through international trade to offset the loss of their their inland provinces after Anting was lost. Actual European military intervention doesn't appear to have been that significant. There were never that many westernized mercenary forces deployed. There were only occasional instances of European forces being involved in expelling the Taiping from various locations, in part because the Europeans' pretext for intervening against the Taiping was that they had a deal with them whereby the Taiping would not approach within 30 miles of Shanghai. So, in theory, they were not required to do anything outside of that 30-mile radius, though that didn't stop them from attacking Taiping-held Ningbo, which was 90 miles away. So I'd say there's a kind of a confluence of three factors of kind of the strength of the provincial resistance, the failure of the Taiping leadership, and to an extent, kind of an accelerating factor in the form of European intervention.
After 14 or so very long years, I'm sure, the war finally comes to an end. What impact does the war have on Chinese society?
What is very fascinating about the Taiping is that they seem to have a cultural effect far larger than any preceding revolt. Later Chinese revolutionary leaders ended up being heavily inspired by the Taiping. Sun Yat-sen, for example, claimed that the Taiping were the precursors to his own brand of Chinese nationalism. Mao Zedong saw the Taiping as precursors to peasant sort of proto-socialism, if you will. There is that on one hand. On the other hand, the Taiping Rebellion has a significant effect on relations between the elite and the masses. The elite becomes significantly empowered as a result of the Taiping War. Because the Qing have to devolve their military authority to the provincial commanders, and they also create a new system of tax called the Li Qin, the transport tax, that is placed in the hands of these regional leaders, local elites become much more powerful. They are more independent politically. They don't require, to as great an extent, central military protection. So they begin to consolidate their power more and more. Zheng Guofan himself doesn't exploit this. There was a worry that he might actually even usurp the throne. But his protégés, Li Hongzhang and Zuo Zongtang, who also get their own provincial armies, become very powerful in the Qing government, and their sort of wider networks of connections become quite powerful as well. Whereas if you look on the mass reaction, the ordinary Chinese peasant, even in regions far away from Taiping control, appears to have actually seen the Taiping as kind of an inspirational model. We have evidence of sort of plays and opera in quite substantial amounts, sort of extolling the Taiping for, during their administration, redistributing land, which was a significant part of their land program, and essentially destroying the power of local landlords and sort of elevating the peasants. What is so, I'd say, emblematic of this to me is in 1903, when there was an attempt to launch a local uprising in Guangdong. There was supposed to be a bomb plot in Canton, and this little rebel cell would rise up and take over the province. And they hired as their leader Hung Xiuquan's nephew, a guy called Hung Xuanfu, who was able to escape the destruction of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. And their banners all sort of claimed that they were successors to the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. And the revolt mostly failed simply because they were found out beforehand. It's kind of my personal what if, the counterfactual of this, what if this little uprising had actually succeeded, at least in setting off the bomb as they were supposed to. But I suppose that's neither here nor there. It's just a very interesting illustration of the resilience of the Taiping in the popular mind. And in fact, if you look on the Monument to the People's Heroes, as it's called in Tiananmen Square, which recounts sort of the great acts of Chinese patriotism and framed at least as resistance against the West, the second event to be memorialized in sort of the great frieze around it is the uprising of the Taiping in Guangxi in 1851.
That's fascinating. Does 21st century China have a strong historical memory about this conflict?
The indication that I have had is that it's in part from living in Hong Kong as well, is that it's not remembered very well. And even when it is, the memory is very complicated. For example, the central government, for example, prioritizes Zheng Guofan and the provincial leaders to a great extent, which is especially interesting when you consider how pro-Taiping Mao was. And the Taiping are kind of sidelined to a great extent. You can see this evolution slightly through the way in which the Taiping are depicted in popular media. The mini-series about the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom from 2000 showed the Taiping as kind of noble but troubled. Whereas there's a recent Jet Li film from 2010 set during the Taiping Rebellion where the Taiping are just kind of faceless mooks as a background to a personal conflict between kind of this righteous Zheng Guofan type bureaucrat and kind of the corrupt mandarinate around him. So there is that sense in which it's a complicated memory in which certainly the government is turning increasingly towards a pro-provincial, pro-Qing even stance, whereas the official view of the Taiping is becoming significantly diminished. Although I've heard that the Taiping are actually slightly better remembered in regions where they are significant, or at the very least that among kind of ordinary Chinese people, there is less of a reverence towards the provincial figures. I think one of the most important angles is, of course, kind of the fact that the Qing dynasty were Manchu and not Han. And so there was, to some extent, a narrative, particularly among the revolutionary and, by extension, pro-Taiping leaders of later years, that those who supported the Qing were, to some extent, race traitors, that they betrayed the Han in favour of their foreign conquerors. And apparently, there is some residual element of that, but I will not comment too much because that information is a few years old at this point.
Now, before we end this fascinating discussion, I'd love to hear if there are any books you'd recommend for any listeners who are probably very interested in the Taiping Rebellion by now.
We can start to an extent with where I started, which is with Jonathan Spence's God's Chinese Son. It's a slightly complex book to recommend because, on the one hand, it is a really compelling discussion of the religious side of this event and on the personal theology of Hung Xiuquan. On the other hand, it really isn't very good at discussing the war's consequences in the long term. So if you read it, there is a risk that you will come out of it with that kind of listicle idea of interesting theology, horrendous but not really well understood consequences. As such, probably I'd recommend first reading Stephen R. Platt's Autumn in the Heavenly Kingdom, which mostly only looks at the last few years of the war. But it's a very compelling look at the way in which not only the Taiping were defeated by the provincials, but also at kind of, to an extent, the counterfactual of what might a Taiping China have looked like, what were, near the end of the Taiping War, what were their aims, what were their goals, what were their ideals, and at how Europe's relationship with China can be seen through the Taiping War, because it is such a break, in a way, with that kind of century of humiliation narrative, that it's not, you can't just see European and West and Chinese interaction in the 19th century as kind of humiliation after humiliation, but rather as kind of ups and downs, where there are periods where the Europeans work against the Qing and periods when they work, in a sense, for them. But to kind of counterbalance the sort of Taiping-centered religious and military political narratives, Toby Meyer Fung's What Remains is an utterly brilliant look at the way in which the war affected ordinary civilians, at how they viewed the conflict going on around them, how they ended up, in some cases, having significant conflicts of identity as to sort of who they identified with and how they showed this identification. And also, at more mundane issues, like what do you do with all these dead bodies is a significant theme in a lot of provincial writings on it. And yeah, that in itself is I think one of the most interesting books to read. So I'd say there's kind of a triumvirate, if you will, of kind of the religious, the military, political, and the social narratives.
EnclavedMicrostate, it has been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
And I hope that you'll come back so we can talk about the Opium Wars.
Yes. I mean, I'll find time for it. How long before I'm allowed back on?
Well, hopefully not too long.
Sure. Yeah. No, I'm perfectly prepared to talk about that as well. So.
Perfect. Well, all your listeners out there, just request EnclavedMicrostate to come back, and hopefully I'll come back too.